Well, good afternoon, everybody. I think we may have some additional folks that join us, but I'd like to just go ahead and get started just in appreciation of everyone's time. Thanks so much for joining us today for this webinar about NIMAS file creation. We're going to be talking about some resources and best practices. And my name's Nicole Gaines. I am the NIMAC project director. And with me this afternoon is Liz Schaller. She is the NIMAC manager. And one of the things that I'd like to just note as before we get into this is that this webinar will be archived and the PowerPoint will also be available on our website to download. If you'd actually like us to email it to you, we're also happy to do that. Our hope would be that this presentation would provide some useful information and that you might actually use the PowerPoint as kind of a resource going forward. In terms of what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be talking a little bit more in the weeds. If you participated in part one of this two-part webinar series, we kind of talked a little bit more about working in the NIMAC system, some of the overarching policies and procedures that underlie NIMAC's operations. Today, it's going to be a lot more technical, and I just wanted to make a note that this is kind of an initial foray for us in a way in terms of getting significantly more into the weeds, talking about some tagging issues, and just to kind of frame that, you know, we are not directly involved in using NIMAS files to create accessible formats, but we do get feedback from our users. We have about 200 users who are authorized users and about 200 more that are accessible media producers. And so when we we've been working kind of intensively in the last 2 to 3 years to really kind of update some best practices and get some input. And so one of the things I like to emphasize is that our goal with this is to really help to ensure that we get really good files so that kids can get their accessible materials more quickly. A lot of the things that we're going to be talking about today come directly from folks who are Braille producers and who have let us know, hey, when these things aren't tagged correctly, it can really delay the Braille production. And so that's really our overarching goal. We're also really interested in your feedback in terms of how well this particular way of presenting the material, if it's helpful, or if you have any other ideas for how we might be able to provide useful information like this going forward. At the very end, there'll be a really brief survey that we hope that you'll be able to take, and that'll give you an opportunity. We're always happy to hear from you, but that's also another opportunity if you have other thoughts of how we can make this better and more helpful for you. So we're going to be kicking it off with talking a little bit about some of the key resources that are used to create NIMAS. And Liz is going to talk with you about that, and as well as how to supply NIMAS metadata and the importance of good metadata. And then we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to get into the weeds a little bit about tagging specific content, and then Liz will circle back and talk about some optional NIMAS content to be aware of, and then we'll wrap it up with just a few brief final hints and where you can go for additional resources. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Liz to talk with you about preparing NIMAS files.
Great, thanks, Nicole, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. We've got a good group here today, and like Nicole said, you know, please throughout the presentation, feel free to add questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that and we can respond there, or when we pause, you know, you're welcome to unmute and ask out loud, either way. So there are really 3 essential resources for you for preparing good quality NIMAS files. And these are the NIMAS 1.1 specification, the DAISY structure guidelines, and the NIMAC metadata guidelines. And we'll be talking about all 3 of those today. So first, the specification. NIMAS 1.1 is the only file format that the NIMAC can accept. It is a subset of DAISY, and each of the NIMAS file sets that we receive includes all of the text from the source book supplied in an XML file, an OPF file that includes required metadata as well as the file set manifest, a PDF that includes only the title page and/or covers and the copyright page of the material, And then all of the images from the print book supplied as separate image files, and these can be JPG, PNG, or SVG format. The NIMAS 1.1 baseline element set must be used to tag textbook content. And this set includes document level tags like the DT book, head, and book tags, structure and hierarchy tags like the front matter, body matter, and rear matter, as well as levels 1 to 6 and headings 1 to 6. And then you have table tags like table, table row, and table data, image tags, as well as a good number of block and inline elements that you can choose from. And some of these include author, lists, notes, sidebars, special definition tags for glossaries, some of those inline elements to capture some formatting information like emphasis, strong emphasis, subscripts and superscripts, as well as page num tags, which we'll talk about a little bit more later on in the presentation. If any of that baseline element set does not look familiar, we do advise that you review the spec to ensure that you're using the tagging set fully. It's important to be familiar with both the specification as well as the DAISY structure guidelines to ensure that content is tagged correctly. I want to note that our automated validation cannot detect whether certain specific content is tagged correctly. So upon our review of the file set, if we identify a tagging issue or if a user reports an issue to us, we may require resubmission of the file. All right, so let's talk about a few elements of that NIMAS file set. All NIMAS file sets must include an OPF that includes required metadata as well as a manifest of all of the files in the file set. And the metadata requirements for that file can be found in our NIMAC metadata guidelines document. I'm going to pop that link in the chat here now. We updated this document last summer, last August. So if you have not downloaded that most current version of the document, I would recommend doing so and taking a look at the changes that we made. And one special note to point out is that if you are providing MathML in your file, all of the fallback images for those MathML expressions should also be included in that OPF manifest. Now, the PDF file that's included in your NIMAS file set is for file verification and cataloging purposes only. It should always include the title page and copyright page, as well as the covers if they're needed. And the covers would be needed if they are the only place that this key information that must be present in the PDF is found. And that key information is the complete title, the ISBNs, the publisher imprint, as well as the copyright statement. And the PDF should not be the entire contents of the book. We do occasionally have situations where someone submits the entire book in the PDF, and that is not needed for NIMAS. We will not accept it. We will actually have to ask for resubmission of that file. The PDF, again, it's for our purposes when we are making sure that the content in our system is cataloged correctly. We use it to verify, and then also our users who are looking at that material that they've purchased to make sure that the file that they downloaded from the system matches the material in front of them. Because the PDF is not used in the production of any accessible format, again, it's just for verification purposes, they do not have to be production quality files. The NIMAC does sometimes see exceptionally large PDF files submitted, and these just add to file processing times without adding any value to the user. So please do go ahead and resave your PDF so that it's only a few megabytes at most if you find that your process is resulting in large PDF files. All right, images. The NIMAS specification requires that all images present in the source book be supplied as separate image files in an images folder. We can accept SVG, PNG, or JPG formats. And images supplied with NIMAS must be at 300 dpi at their original size and resolution. This is really important because one of the accessible formats that can be produced from NIMAS is large print. So all of the images in your file set need to be able to be enlarged and still be clear and crisp for that student. A couple important notes: text should not be supplied as image files, and images should not be used to provide entire pages of books. I think we see this most often with supplementary readers or books for young children, but this is not an appropriate type of image to be supplied for NIMAS files. A note on image quality. Please do not resave lower resolution images as 300 dpi in order to meet the DPI requirement. Resaving in this way can result in blurry images that won't be usable in producing accessible formats, especially large print and digital formats. And we do check the images as part of our file review process, and we will require resubmission of low quality images, even if the properties show 300 dpi. And this does occasionally get reported to us by users who utilize NIMAS to produce large print, and we will ask for resubmission.
And this is Nicole, just to kind of chime in on that. We're not able to do an exhaustive check of all images, but we will do a spot check. So it's always possible that you may have a file that's certified, but then we find out about it through a user. So just as a heads up, it's not common that we will have to require resubmission after a file has been certified, but it does come up from time to time.
Thanks, Nicole. And then again, text as images. This is an important topic. The NIMAS format requires that the text of the book be provided in the XML file. So even if text is provided as an image in the print book, it does need to be supplied in the XML file for NIMAS. Similarly, images should not be used to provide entire pages of books. So images that contain text that cannot be meaningfully extracted from the image should repeat that text as alt text or as a prod note in the XML file. This is extremely important because this text is utilized to produce Braille. So all of the text that's in that book, even if it is images in that original print book, needs to be in that XML file.
And this is Nicole again to chime in on that particular thing. We're going to talk a little bit later about alt text. And just to clarify, alt text is generally optional for NIMAS in terms of providing image descriptions. But this would be seen as a case where there's actually text in the book that has to be provided. So you're not actually describing the image, you're simply repeating the text that is provided in that image. And so this would be a case that we would consider that alt text or a prod note, if it happens to be very extensive text, that those would actually be required and not optional in that case. So if you're ever unsure about whether content would be required or not, just let us know.
And optionally for NIMAS, like Nicole just said, one of the things that's optional is to provide alt text for images and prod notes for longer description. So this would be like an actual image description itself, not text that is placed in the image. And then MathML tagging is also optional for NIMAS, as well as utilizing the full DAISY element set for XML tagging. These are all optional requirements, or optional above the baseline requirements for NIMAS.
And to address, there was a question from David Nelson in the chat that I want to go ahead and address. He asks if the NIMAS content represents a digital publication, are 300 dpi images still required? That is a really good question. And the answer to that is still yes. And we know that we've had on one or two occasions, fortunately, this has not come up a lot yet, but there have been cases where it's been more challenging to get those higher resolution images. If you are a publisher who does not have 300 dpi quality images in your source material, contact us. We can kind of have a discussion of that. This generally should not be an issue for print-based materials, which are still the vast majority of files that we're receiving, but we are aware that this can be more challenging if your source material is possibly EPUB or HTML or some other digital format. So do reach out if you have questions about that. Thanks for that question, David.
So kind of an exciting possible update to the NIMAS standard. As a file format published in federal regulations, NIMAS can only be changed through legislative or regulatory action. And in the coming months and in 2024, the NIMAC is going to be doing some intensive outreach to our stakeholders to gain input to inform whether the NIMAC should request an update to NIMAS through regulatory action. We will greatly value your input, and we will be reaching out fairly soon, so please do stay tuned for more information about that. Okay, now let's turn to the DAISY structure guidelines. In addition to using the prescribed tags, it is also required that tagging of content for NIMAS be done in accordance with the DAISY structure guidelines. And I'm putting that link there in the chat for you. Following the guidelines helps to ensure that your files are tagged correctly and will be usable in producing accessible formats. And just to note, automated validation cannot evaluate adherence to the structure guidelines. Again, this is something that our manual file check may result in some errors or issues that we require resubmission for, as well as if a user reports an issue with a file to us. The DAISY structure guidelines provide guidance on how to tag major structural elements. This guidance includes levels, syntax, divisions, class attributes, alternative level markup, front matter, body matter, and end matter. The DSG also provides an index of elements. And from the index, you can find information related to DAISY elements, including the definition, syntax, and examples. This index can also be used to locate the definitions for all attributes. It's extremely helpful. We use it all the time, and I'm going to put that link in the chat as well. So here's an example on your screen now of the entry for Sidebar. So you can see how it provides you with the definition of that information as well as the appropriate syntax. And then there will be examples as well. Sometimes there are quite a few examples. It depends on the element. As mentioned earlier, automated validation cannot detect errors in applying the DAISY structure guidelines. However, if issues are found in the manual file review or by a user reporting them to us, corrections will be required. And if you have any questions at all about how to correctly tag specific content, please do reach out to us for further assistance. We're always happy to help.
And one thing that I'll just make a note of is that we find that the DAISY structure guidelines are really helpful, but one caveat is that they are not exhaustive. And so we have ourselves had the experience before where we've gone into the structure guidelines to look for a particular situation and that example isn't there. So we'll say that, you know, it will not, it doesn't answer all questions and solve all mysteries, but it can be very useful to have it as a resource. But if you do find this particular situation we're trying to figure out isn't in there, we're happy to talk with you about it and see if we can kind of figure out what the best way forward is.
Absolutely. And I guess I can take a minute now to pause and see if there are any other questions before we move on to talking about metadata. I'm not seeing any in the chat, but if you do have a question, please feel free to unmute and ask it out loud.
You know, I do have a question, guys. I'm still confused about whether or not alt text for images is required. I do work as an editor at a textbook publisher, but I'm not usually part of creating the NIMAS files. But I know that, you know, there's been a lot of talk on our end about creating alt text for imagery in, you know, like K through 8 books. And I was confused when you said it's optional, but unless there is text within the images. So could you clarify that, please?
Sure. This is Nicole again. And so basically we encourage alt text, and we'll be talking more about this later, but it's great, and when it's high quality, it's really beneficial. In terms of the actual requirements of the specification in those IDEA 2004 regulations, though, it is optional. We would consider, however, if you have text that's captured as an image, you know, then in that case, and that's exceptional. That doesn't happen super often. But if you had, for example, let me give you an example of something that recently we saw, and that was a kid's book, and there was an image of a handwritten letter, right? And so what the vendor had originally done was they just submitted that image, but that was important educational content on that page, and they just provided that image without any alt text, without a prod note. And so that's actual text captured as an image that would need to be a part of the XML. So that's why I was mentioning, if you have any questions about specific, if the vendor has questions, then we can address those or answer those questions. But generally speaking, you know, you have a picture of a human cell. You don't have to provide an image description of that unless, however, the customer requires it. And we do see that there are some folks out there, the NIMAC isn't directly involved in any contracts between the customers and the publishers, but we do know that there are customers who require alt text. So we are getting, I believe, more and more alt text as a result of those contracts. And in the same way, MathML is also optional, but there are customers who say, hey, we want MathML in our NIMAS, so please be sure to put it in there. So does that help?
It does. It does. Thank you. That
Sure.
does clarify. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Great. Well, let's move on to metadata. But if you think of any questions later on, you know, feel free to pop them in the chat. So all NIMAS files must include required metadata in the OPF that is in the file set. And including correct, complete metadata is absolutely essential in ensuring your materials can be successfully located in the system. This is the main way that your customers who purchased your material can go to the NIMAC and verify that we have the files that correspond with the materials they're using in the classroom. So metadata review is a really important part of the file certification process. And as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the NIMAC metadata guidelines can be downloaded at any time, and these should be used as guidance for correctly submitting metadata. The NIMAC system offers a text box search for title, author, series, ISBN, and identifier, which would be the ISBN plus NIMAS, as well as pick list filters for all of the other metadata. What's important to note is that we are not so fancy as to have Google search appliance within the NIMAC website. So your customers who are coming to our website are not going to be able to have a close search that'll pull up matches. These are exact searches that pull up exact matches. So that's why it is so important that the metadata that we have for your files in the system is 100% accurate. The metadata that is supplied in your OPF file is automatically extracted upon upload, and that creates the NIMAC system record for that file. So not including required metadata will cause this extraction as well as your upload to fail. And this is the case whether you are manually uploading the file or delivering it by FTP. When reviewing the file metadata, we check for the OPF metadata against the cover, title page, and copyright page PDF, like we mentioned earlier. And we use standard library cataloging practices to ensure that the metadata supplied matches the book and that the XML file also reflects this same information. So we want to make sure that the ISBN in that XML file matches the ISBN in the PDF, as well as the ISBN that was supplied as metadata. And even if a publisher uses different metadata internally to track items, say you have your own kind of cataloging system or purchase order numbering system, the print book itself we consider to be the authoritative source for NIMAS metadata. And so that is what we base our review and certification process on. Our staff does routinely make minor metadata corrections at the point of file review so that files can be quickly certified. These corrections that we make are automatically saved to the system as well as to the OPF file. However, we may need to require that metadata be corrected by the vendor if there are multiple errors affecting a delivery or an issue impacts a large number of files. So say there was a large group of files submitted for a publisher for a new program, and the title formatting is not the way that it needs to be. We may need to ask the vendor to go ahead and correct that title metadata for us, depending on the number of files and the volume of what we're currently working on. If you haven't already, please do review the NIMAC metadata guidelines that were published last summer. So if you're new to the NIMAC or if you've been around a while, we did make a few updates there. And if you're a publisher who's working with a vendor, please ensure that you supply the complete metadata for the NIMAS submission. We're always very happy to help you get started with that process if you have questions.
And this is Nicole, just kind of as a side note to that, we have occasionally received books that were like Algebra 1, and the vendor made the assumption, oh, grade 1. And so even if you feel like the grade level information, for example, is intuitive and you don't need to explicitly provide it, please do just, you know, all of the required metadata, just make sure that the vendor does have that, because they may not be able to find that on their own. And yeah, we can send you, I think Catherine had a question. Oh, Liz already did it. There was a request for the metadata guidelines. Liz got those put in there. So thank you, Liz.
Sure, no problem. Very unusually, we actually have an update to share with you regarding NIMAC metadata, and that is that we'll be putting in place 2 minor changes to our metadata to simplify the requirements. The first that we're really pleased to announce is that we will be removing publisher place as a requirement in our metadata. We found, especially in the last couple of years, that some publishers don't really have a formal office anymore, and they're not even certain what to provide for that field any longer. So we're really pleased to be able to remove that requirement. And then the other major change is that numerical edition will use only the NIMAS source edition tag going forward. So the DC terms description version tag will be used only for the national or state edition. There will not be that duplication. We expect to announce these changes going into effect by late summer, and there will be a grace period so that publishers and vendors can implement the changes into their workflows. During that period of time, if publisher place and or the DC terms element for numerical edition are present in the OPF, they will simply be disregarded by the system. And we will certainly share more information with you all as we get closer to implementing those changes. If you're unsure of whether you are on the right track with metadata for a specific title or program, we welcome your metadata queries. You can email us at nimac@aph.org, and we're happy to review your PDF against your OPF or proposed metadata and let you know if there are any issues or corrections that we would recommend before submission. We really encourage you to take advantage of this service, especially if you are preparing a new program that has a lot of files, to make sure that you're on track and that those submissions can be reviewed and certified very quickly once we receive them. And as Nicole mentioned in their first session, if you were with us last week for part 1, the NIMAC does offer a free tool within the system for generating correctly tagged and formatted OPF metadata. We encourage you to explore this option, especially if you are preparing a very large program for delivery. And just to note, we don't have a timeline yet for updating the Excel to OPF tool to adjust for the upcoming metadata changes. Again, we will keep you all updated throughout that process. In order to utilize this Excel to OPF tool, simply download the metadata template from the Resources tab of your NIMAC account, fill in one line of the sheet for each OPF you need, and then upload it using the Transform Excel to OPF menu option. The system will email you a zip file that includes a starter OPF for every item included in the Excel sheet. This starter OPF will contain all of the correctly tagged and formatted metadata. But importantly, it will not be complete yet. You will still need to add the manifest and the spine portions of the OPF. Once you do that, your file will be ready to use in your NIMAS file set. All right, we'll just pause real quickly again here for questions, and then I'm going to hand it over to Nicole, and she's going to get into some best practices for XML tagging. All right, I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay, well, I'm going to spend some time now really getting into the weeds with tagging of some specific items that are commonly found in the NIMAS files. If you are not real in the weeds, this might be a good time to go get a cookie or a sandwich or something else, because this is going to be more on the technical side, and we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. So we actually had a question just a moment ago from David in the chat about list tagging. And so I'm glad that he had a question about it, because this is something that is, it's pretty important for NIMAS. Lists are pretty common in instructional materials. And we actually just recently found out some information with regard to the amount of support for different types of lists. So what I wanted to cover with regard to lists is that generally speaking, the type attribute is not needed. If you have a list that doesn't have any numbering or bullets, think of table of contents or index. But for lists that do have bullets or numbering, there are 3 type attribute options that are a part of the NIMAS specification. One of them is unordered, or UL, ordered, OL, or pre-formatted, PL. Those are our 3 different possibilities. And basically the way that it works is that in theory, if you have a list and use the type UL, the software that's converting that NIMAS file should automatically render bullets for each list item. For an ordered list, it should do a similar thing, but it should automatically put numbering in there. There are some additional attributes for the type. There's an enum, or enumeration attribute, which is, it's optional for NIMAS. But if you choose it, in theory, it should indicate to the software whether it's integers or letters or Roman numerals. And so that's the third type, or the second type. And then the third type is pre-formatted. And in this type of list, there is no numbering or bullets automatically provided, and any kind of list item designation is just provided within the tags. As a side note, as Liz kind of alluded to when she was talking about the baseline element set, there are specific tags used for glossaries, and we will talk about that a little further on. In terms of some helpful hints regarding the different types and how to structure your lists, one basic area of feedback is that we often see that vendors have kind of done some double tagging with paragraphs inside list items. That's really not necessary. If you have more than one component, you can use, you can either just include the information in there. For example, we have a list item below for Great Smoky Mountains, page 55, that's like from an index. You can use the list item component, which is an optional full daisy tag for those components of a list item, but you don't need to use paragraph tags. Paragraph tags, especially if there's only one list item component, it doesn't really add any value. On the other side of that, if you find that you have more than 2 list item components, you may need to consider tagging the content as a table. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment when we talk about tables. If you choose ordered list type, we would say do not include numbering inside the list item tags, because what that means is that if the software does know what an ordered list is. That's going to result in double numbering of the list items. And this actually came up for us just recently. We found this issue in a file. As a practical recommendation, we have found recently that there is a lot of software that's used to create Braille or other accessible formats from NIMAS that doesn't actually recognize the type attribute. This was kind of a surprise to us, that it seems like it's hit or miss. Some software knows how to handle it, some doesn't. So one of the things that you may want to consider is just using the pre-formatted list type, and that's the type that where you actually just have your bullets or the numbering inside the list item tags, and that's really going to be the better supported option in the conversion software that's using NIMAS. So again, in theory, ordered list and unordered list should work, but we find that it doesn't always work. So I think that our practical recommendation would be that if it's just as easy for you, go ahead and just use pre-formatted list and include that, the numbers or letters or what have you, inside those list items. Another helpful hint that I would like to share with folks, and again, this is actually more related to using NIMAS for formats like EPUB and HTML and less for Braille. But one of the best practices that we do like to share is the inclusion of internal links when tagging index or table of contents entries. And we see that a lot of vendors do this, not all vendors do it, but if it's something that you can easily incorporate, it can be super helpful. It just really helps when students with disabilities are using that digital format. It can really help them with navigating and using that digital book. Now we're going to circle back around and talk for a minute about glossary tagging. Again, the glossaries are a special kind of list that have their own tags in the DAISY specification. And the definition list is wrapped in a DL tag and is used in conjunction with DT for definition term and DD definition tags. And so that's kind of the way that it's structured. There's just a really, really simple example here. You're going to have your DL that wraps the different terms and definitions in your list. One of the things that we commonly see, and I'm not really sure why, is we'll see glossaries where there's a DL tag that's wrapping every glossary item, and that's not what we want. And I will note that in terms of Braille production, it's really helpful to have the tagging correct for glossaries, because there's a special way that they're handled in Braille, and having this tagged in the right way is really beneficial for that. I did want to note, I've got a sample glossary snip right here. And so you may be wondering, well, what if you have subdivisions within your glossary? This is actually taken directly from the DAISY structure guidelines. I did actually doctor it up a little bit to add some more entries. But basically what you see here is that if you have a subdivision, that's not a problem. You will have a separate list. Like what we see here is that the glossary is subdivided alphabetically. These are the entries under the letter A. And so you may not have a DL that wraps the entire glossary, but for each sublist under each level 2 that you have there for the different letters of the alphabet, that's what's going to wrap those entries. So if you have any questions as you're working with glossaries, let us know. And I do want to kind of segue from that to going back to that question about lists versus tables. Again, if there are more than 2 components to each list, you may need to mark it up as a table. And this is actually something that we sometimes do see with glossaries. We will see multilingual glossaries where there's a definition, there's a term, there's a definition, there's a term in Spanish, and then there's a Spanish definition. And so it can be very difficult to tag that and have that work as a list. And sometimes it may be presented in the print book as a table for that very reason. And so if you have questions about those kinds of things, just let us know. But if you find that you're kind of torn of like, okay, I know this is a glossary and I'm supposed to use the glossary tags. However, it's just not going to work because of the way it's structured. We do understand that sometimes it is going to be necessary to use a table structure for that. And so to get into the weeds a little bit with table tagging, these are marked up with the table element, and there are several additional tags that you may use in conjunction with your table, depending on how complex that table is. You may not see these, you may not have a caption with every table. You may not have row or column headings for each table, but you may. And so one reminder we just want to note is that tables should always be marked up in the XML. This is it's a little bit similar to, not capturing text in XML, as a general rule, not providing the entire page of a children's book as an image, that kind of thing. But it should be transcribed in the XML so that it would be accessible to produce Braille and other accessible formats. So one of the things I wanted to just emphasize is that we sometimes see cases where tables do include those column headings, but for whatever reason, they have not been captured correctly in the table tagging. So this is something that's really, really helpful. Again, in terms of navigation, in terms of correctly rendering the content when you're producing Braille and other formats and digital formats as well. So what I have here in this slide is I actually have a really simple table over to the left, and just kind of an example here of how, if you do have these column headings in your table, please put those in the T head tag, and then you're just going to have a table row like you ordinarily would, and then you just use TH for each of those table heading or column heading cells. So again, it's not super complicated. It's just something that we sometimes see gets overlooked, and we'd like to just remind folks to be sure and use those tags when you have a table that has those headings. The next thing I want to talk about for just a couple minutes is pagination and page break tags. These can actually be really important in terms of creating the accessible formats. And so I just want to take a couple of moments to cover some things about how page number tags should be used. And the first thing is to just talk a little bit about the page attribute. This is something that is required on all page num tags, and the good news is that it's pretty simple and straightforward. The front attribute is for Roman numerals found in the front matter. Normal is used for integer only pagination, and special is used for everything else. We do find that it's really common for combinations of letters and numbers to be used for special sections of textbooks, and so you would just use special for that situation. And you also need to just be sure and use special if you have an empty tag. One of the things that we sometimes see is that we'll have somebody has indicated that the page numbering is blank. They've not included a page number, but they've had normal included as the page type. And believe it or not, that can actually hang up conversion in some software. So just make sure that you use special if you ever have an empty tag. One of the things that I also like to mention is that if the print-based material has no pagination, but it's physical and there are physical breaks, and sometimes, sometimes this does come up. We occasionally get materials like flashcards, and flashcards, they're not going to have numbers, but they do have breaks between the physical pieces, right? And so it is really important in ensuring that those are rendered correctly into accessible formats to include the page number tag to show where those breaks happen. Another thing that I like to just mention, and just to clarify, that would be a case where you would just have the empty tags, page num, empty tags, page attribute, special. But one of the things that may not be as well known is that it is fine if you have unnumbered pages that are within the sequence of numbered pagination to go ahead and tag those in the number that they are. So say, for example, you have page 5 has text on it. It has a number on the page. Page 6 has no number on the page. It just has a picture. that's as big as the whole page, and then the next page is page 7. We would actually want, in order to indicate the actual that it's still a part of the sequence, to actually include page 6 on that page, even though it doesn't have a number on the physical page. So it would just be paged as normal. The next topic I want to just talk about briefly is write-on lines. This is another area where there can be a lot of confusion, simply because this is an area that's not really directly addressed in the NIMAS specification. And considering how common it is to have write-on lines in instructional materials, especially workbooks, this was kind of an oversight, I think, back when the specification was being worked on. So folks sometimes try to do a range of creative things in order to try to provide these write-on lines, or they'll just leave them out. So what we advise is that really your best option is to use span tags and just use underscores, you know, the underscores character, to create that write-on line in the book. We definitely want those to be captured. It's going to be really important. If you produced a large print book, for example, you want to make sure that those lines are there for the student to write on. So if you have any questions about that, just let us know. A question from David: is the length of the underscore line arbitrary? I would say that it should be just in line in terms of the other text that's on the page. So in other words, if it's supposed to be, the student is supposed to have 50 characters or 100 characters of writing space, then make it be in sync with that. And that's actually a good question, because we recently saw a situation where somebody had created some write-on lines, but they were only about 5 characters long, whereas the actual content in the book was considerably longer. So there may be cases where you just have to kind of eyeball that. I'm not sure, but you know, you definitely want it to try to be in line with what the student would be having in terms of the space that they would be writing on in the actual book. Thank you for that question. Let me go ahead and address another question that just came in. Christine says, we've been advised to use page breaks for areas where students can draw in workbooks. Is this practice still recommended? You know, I'm actually going to talk about that particular issue. Well, not that, I actually have not heard of that before, but I would say that if you do not have a physical break in the page, don't add a page break there. We actually, this very next, this might actually help you here in terms of this very next topic here, which is using paragraph tags to code blank space. We sometimes see this, that you know, that a vendor will put a whole line of paragraph tags to try to create blank space. We really don't want that to be done. If there is a place that's just blank space on the page where the student needs to draw in a workbook, your better option there is to use break tags. Those are the line break tag, or BR. You can use that if you need to. The general rule would be that since NIMAS tagging is semantic and we're not really trying to capture the exact physical layout, that generally you're not going to need break tags to indicate small amounts of space that happen there. But if there are, you know, if you need to use breaks to create a little empty space there, you can use that tag for that. There's another question about if we have large draw boxes for them to draw. And I will say that sometimes, Catherine, what we see with that, I mean, it's probably what you might want to do in that is, we've actually seen where folks have actually included an image of a box. And even though that seems like it might be kind of weird, it actually is probably going to be the best alternative, because if that's something that's not needed, like it won't be needed for Braille, for example, but the transcriber would just disregard it. But if you were going to create like large print, you would actually be able to reproduce that box and have that in the large print so that it shows up just as it does in the print book. Another question from David. Okay to punt with a prod note comment describing a special situation. I'm not sure what I mean, in terms of just having a production note that says, for example, there's 2 inches of space for writing or that kind of, I think that that is fine as well. You know, I think part of what can be tricky with NIMAS is that it's used to produce a lot of different formats. And so a prod note, that's something that a transcriber, that I think that it wouldn't hurt, because a transcriber could look at that and say, oh, okay, that's what's going on here. In terms of actually accommodating if there's an automated translation, like to Daisy or EPUB, you know, Bookshare, for example, they produce a lot of formats for kids through an automated process that there's not really a human being involved. And so we kind of try to figure out what's going to work best across as many formats as possible. But I think a prod note never hurts. So yeah, so that would be an alternative in terms of trying to describe what's happening on the page. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Liz to talk a little bit about image descriptions and MathML. And as we go forward, again, if you have any further questions, just feel free to put those in the chat, and we'll also have additional time later for more questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, so I'll try to go through this a little bit quickly so we can get to the wrap-up portion at the end. So first, getting into image descriptions, which have already come up a little bit today as well. So as Nicole expounded upon earlier, alt text is recommended but not required for NIMAS. However, the alt attribute must be present on all image tags. All images, including those fallback images for MathML, must have that alt attribute present, but it can be empty. If you are providing alt text for NIMAS, it should be no more than 1 to 2 sentences, with longer descriptions for more complex images supplied using the prod note element instead. And we do have some more information on our website about image descriptions, as well as some resources if you are considering writing image descriptions for your material. I put that link in the chat, so please do take a look at that. If you are providing alt text for your NIMAS files, we strongly recommend that publisher staff write or at a minimum review any alt text that is supplied with NIMAS files. For alt text to be useful to students, it must be clearly written, grammatically correct, age appropriate, and relevant to the text. You should think of alt text as a piece of the curriculum that is part of your material. It goes along with the other material in the book, so it should match up as being written at that same grade level for that same audience. And I will note that if alt text includes spelling errors or grammatical mistakes, we will require that it either be corrected or removed from the file. We do check the alt text for every file that we receive, and we will request resubmission if needed. Now, moving on to MathML. As hopefully most of you are already a little bit familiar with MathML, it is an optional markup for NIMAS that makes math and scientific notation accessible. It is a way to provide math in your NIMAS files rather than just supplying it as images. MathML 3.0 is the current standard, but MathML 2 can still be accepted for NIMAS. And we have a MathML and NIMAS guidance document. I'm placing that link in the chat as well. And that document includes the information that you'll find here on the following slides. This slide here shows the MathML 3 declaration. This would be required to be at the top of your file if you're providing MathML 3.0 in your file. And then here is the declaration for MathML 2.0, so you can see the difference here. And again, this is something that we check for every file that we receive that contains MathML. Fallback images for all MathML expressions must be provided in the file set. This is extremely important because not every accessible format production software can support the use of MathML. So sometimes our users will download the files that you've provided to the NIMAC with the MathML stripped out if they cannot utilize it in their software. So in those instances, it's extremely important that those images be provided in the file set. And again, as I mentioned earlier, those images do also need to be referenced in the OPF manifest as well. And the same image requirements apply to these. They should also be supplied at 300 DPI, and the alt attribute should be present. Alt text is not required for MathML, just like it's not required for the other images in your file. However, that attribute is required, and you can see an example here on the slide. You can just leave it empty unless you are providing a description of the equation. And we didn't talk about this earlier, but placeholder text is not something that we want to see in those alt tags, and we will request resubmission if you provide something like math or image or decorative in your alt text. Again, we do check those, and we will request that that be resubmitted. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Nicole.
Great. And these are actually three really quick reminders. So I know we're kind of coming up to the end of our time, but just a few things that come up sometimes that we want folks to be aware of. The first one is, please always be sure to transcribe the complete title page information in the XML. We know that vendors are including doc title and doc author tags. However, most software using NIMAS doesn't pay attention to those. And so even if you've got your full title and your doc authors included there, we do need to ask that you transcribe the information that is on the title page in regular XML tags as well, so that we're absolutely sure that all of that information is present in an accessible format that's produced from your file. Second pointer, even though the head tag is used for metadata in full DAISY, it's not used for NIMAS. So this can be kind of confusing to folks, because ordinarily we say, if you want to use full DAISY tags, you're welcome to do that. But this is a particular area where we don't want that metadata in the head tag of the XML. All you need to worry about is having it in your OPF. The head tag for NIMAS should just be empty. And then the third one is that we know a lot of folks use Macs, and there is a quirk that can sometimes happen where if you compress a file or create a zip file rather in using a Mac computer, it will create some little extraneous files. These can cause the automated batch upload process to fail. And so we just want to make sure, if you're using a Mac, make sure that you're not adding any extra little things in there that don't need to be in there. By the same token, we just want to make sure that if there's other content that you need to deliver to a customer or whatever, just don't include it in the NIMAS zip file, include it in some other way. So the last thing I want to say to wrap up, thank you guys so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We have archived videos and other resources on our website, including all the stuff that Liz has put in the chat today. And we just encourage you to take a look at our website, visit it. If you have not been there, take a look at what we've got. And I just want to give a really quick shout out to the National AIM Center at CAST. They have CAST has a very long history of involvement with the NIMAS specification, and we recently worked with them to update some of the resources on their page. This is actually where you'll find the NIMAS specification, and they also have some NIMAS exemplars that are on their site that can be helpful if you are brand new, especially to working with NIMAS. Always happy to hear from folks. Feel free to email us, nimac@aph.org. We also have an 800 number. We're usually in the office about 8 to 4:30, but we answer our voicemails. So if you are in a different part, not the Eastern US, we still would love to hear from you. And with that, I would just like to say again, we really appreciate your time, and we do hope that you could just take a quick moment and respond to our survey. We're real interested in whether this training was helpful to you. If you have any thoughts about how we can further support you guys as you're producing your NIMAS files, we would love to hear from you. So with that, thanks again, and talk to everybody again soon, we hope. Thanks so much.